The blood on her dress was not her own, but Katherine Calloway ran as though death itself chased her through the Dakota Territory grasslands, her lungs burning with each desperate breath, as the September sun beat down mercilessly on her back. She could still hear the gunshots echoing in her mind, still see her brother's face as he pushed her toward the window and told her to run, run, and never look back. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, golden grasses whipping against her legs as she stumbled forward, her dark hair pulling free from its pins and tangling in the wind. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the horror she had witnessed in that dusty saloon where everything had gone so terribly wrong. Her foot caught on a hidden gopher hole, and she went down hard, her palms scraping against the rough earth. Katherine lay there gasping, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and shock, unable to force herself to stand again. The vastness of the sky above felt crushing rather than freeing, and for the first time since she had climbed through that window, tears began to stream down her dirt-streaked face. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. She tried to push herself up, to run again, but her legs refused to cooperate. The horse drew closer, and she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for whatever came next, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Easy now." The voice was low and calm, the kind of voice you might use with a frightened animal. "I am not going to hurt you." Katherine forced her eyes open and looked up at the man sitting astride a paint horse. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of cedar wood that studied her, with a mixture of concern and wariness. A cowboy, she thought distantly, noting his worn leather chaps and the hat that shaded his face from the afternoon sun. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. "Please," she managed to whisper, though she was not entirely sure what she was asking for. "Please help me. Please leave me alone. Please make this nightmare end." He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "My name is Zachary Rourke. I have a homestead about 2 miles west of here." He gestured vaguely behind him. "You are hurt?" Katherine shook her head, then immediately contradicted herself by saying, "I do not know." Everything felt disconnected, as though she were watching this scene happen to someone else. Zachary crouched down a few feet away from her, keeping his distance. His gaze took in her torn dress, the blood spatters, the wild tangle of her hair. "That blood, not mine," she said quickly. "It is not my blood." He nodded slowly, processing this information. "You running from the law or from trouble?" "Trouble." The word came out as barely more than a breath. "So much trouble." "Can you stand?" When she did not answer, he moved closer, extending his hand. "Let me help you up. You cannot stay out here. There is a storm coming in from the north, and you will freeze once the sun goes down. September nights get cold in Dakota Territory." Katherine looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before placing her scraped palm in his. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from years of hard work. He pulled her to her feet gently, steadying her when she swayed. "I have to keep moving," she said, though her body screamed in protest at the thought. "They might be following." "Who might be following?" She shook her head, unable to form the words, unable to explain what had happened. "I cannot tell you. It is better if you do not know. Just point me toward the nearest town and I will go." Zachary studied her for a long moment, his cedar eyes thoughtful. "The nearest town is Fargo, North Dakota, about 15 miles northeast. But you will not make it on foot before dark, and you certainly will not make it if that storm catches you." He paused. "My homestead has a spare room. You can rest there tonight, get cleaned up, and decide what you want to do, come morning. No questions asked if that is what you prefer." Every instinct Katherine had learned in her 22 years told her not to trust strange men, especially not out here in the middle of nowhere. But exhaustion and fear had left her with few options, and something in Zachary Rourke's steady gaze made her want to believe he was decent. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character, though recent events had shaken that confidence considerably. "I do not have money to pay you," she admitted. "I did not ask for money." He moved back to his horse and swung up into the saddle, then extended his arm down to her. "Come on. We need to get moving if we want to beat that weather." Katherine took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep from sliding off, and she could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt. The paint horse started forward at an easy walk, and Katherine rested her cheek against Zachary's broad back, too tired to maintain her posture any longer. They rode in silence across the prairie, and Katherine watched the landscape roll by with dull eyes. The grasslands were beautiful in their own stark way, endless and wild and untamed, so different from the tidy streets of Philadelphia where she had grown up, where everything had its place and purpose. That world felt impossibly distant now, as though it had belonged to someone else entirely. The sky was darkening when Zachary's homestead came into view. It was modest but well-maintained, a single-story wooden structure with a barn and a small corral where several horses grazed. Chickens pecked in the yard, and Katherine could see a vegetable garden that had been carefully tended. Everything spoke of hard work and attention to detail, of a man who took pride in what he had built. Zachary dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady on her waist. "Let me get Buck settled, and then I will show you inside." Katherine nodded and stood in the yard, hugging herself against the cooling air. She could see clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and ominous. Zachary moved with efficient purpose as he unsaddled the paint horse and led him into the barn. She heard him speaking softly to the animal, the words indistinct, but the tone gentle. He emerged a few minutes later and gestured for her to follow him. "Come on, let us get you inside before the rain starts." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and well-worn furniture testified to years of use. Everything was tidy, which surprised Katherine slightly. She had somehow expected a bachelor homestead to be messier. "The spare room is through there," Zachary said, pointing to the door on the left. "It is not much, but the bed is clean. I will heat some water so you can wash up if you like." "Thank you," Katherine said softly. The simple kindness of his offer made her throat tighten with emotion. "I do not know how to repay you for this. Like I said, I am not asking for repayment." He moved to the stove and began building a fire. "I have some stew left from yesterday. Are you hungry?" Katherine realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten. "Yes, thank you." She retreated to the spare room and closed the door, leaning against it as she finally allowed herself to truly absorb what had happened. Her brother Thomas was dead. She had watched the gambler's bullet hit him square in the chest, had seen him fall, and she had run, just as he had told her to do, leaving him bleeding on that saloon floor. Guilt and grief washed over her in equal measure. Thomas had been her only family since their parents died of influenza 2 years ago. He had brought her west with promises of a fresh start, of opportunities and adventures. Instead, he had gotten involved with dangerous men and dangerous games. And now, he was gone. A soft knock on the door made her straighten. "I have hot water for you," Zachary called. "I will leave it outside the door." Katherine waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before opening the door and retrieving the basin of steaming water. He had also left a clean towel and what appeared to be a shirt of his that she could change into. The thoughtfulness of it made her eyes sting with fresh tears. She stripped off her ruined dress and scrubbed the dirt and blood from her skin, watching the water turn murky and rust-colored. Her hands shook as she worked, and she had to stop several times to simply breathe, to remind herself that she was alive and safe, at least for the moment. The shirt Zachary had provided was far too large on her, hanging past her knees like a nightgown. She rolled up the sleeves and used her fingers to work through the worst tangles in her hair, though it remained a wild, snarled mess that hung past her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized the pale, haunted-eyed woman staring back at her. When she emerged from the room, Zachary was ladling stew into 2 bowls at the table. He glanced up, and his gaze flickered briefly over her appearance before he gestured to a chair. "Sit. Eat." The stew was simple but hearty, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of venison. Katherine ate mechanically at first, but as the warm food hit her stomach, she realized how desperately hungry she was. She finished the entire bowl and accepted a second helping without protest. Zachary ate his own meal in silence, asking no questions, making no demands. The quiet felt almost companionable, and Katherine found herself relaxing slightly despite everything. When they had both finished eating, he cleared the dishes and then settled into a chair by the fireplace, pulling out a knife and a piece of wood that he began to whittle. Katherine sat at the table, watching him work. His hands moved with practiced skill, shaving away thin curls of wood to reveal some shape he saw within. The rain had started, a steady drumming against the roof that somehow made the house feel even cozier. "I should go to the law," Katherine said finally, breaking the silence. "I should tell them what happened." Zachary did not look up from his whittling. "That depends on what happened." She was quiet for a long moment, gathering her courage. "My brother and I came to Fargo 3 months ago from Philadelphia. Our parents died, and there was nothing left for us back east. Thomas, that was my brother, he thought we could start fresh out here, but he fell in with some men who played cards, high-stakes games." She swallowed hard. "He won a lot of money off a man named Garrett Vance, only it turned out Vance was cheating, and Thomas caught him at it and called him out in front of everyone." "Let me guess," Zachary said quietly. "Vance did not take kindly to that. He shot Thomas, right there in the saloon, in front of at least 30 witnesses, and then his men." She closed her eyes, seeing it all again. "They just stood there? Nobody helped. Nobody called for the marshal. Thomas told me to run, so I did. I climbed out a window and I just ran." "This Vance, he is someone important in Fargo?" "He owns half the businesses in town. The saloon, the hotel, the general store. I heard people say the marshal is on his payroll." Katherine's hands clenched into fists on the table. "So, what good would going to the law do? They would probably just hand me over to Vance." Zachary set down his whittling and looked at her directly. "You think Vance would come after you? I am the only family Thomas had. And I was there. I saw what happened." She met his gaze. "Yes, I think he will come after me. I think he has to make sure I do not talk." "Then you cannot go back to Fargo. Not yet, anyway." Zachary leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There is a territorial marshal who comes through these parts every few months. His name is John Whitaker, and he is honest, probably the only truly honest lawman in Dakota Territory. If you could get word to him about what happened, he might be able to do something." "When does he come through next?" "I am not sure. Could be next week, could be next month. The territory is large and he covers a lot of ground." Zachary paused. "You are welcome to stay here until we can get word to him. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I give you my word that you will be safe under my roof." Katherine studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. She found only steady sincerity in those cedar eyes. "Why would you do that for a stranger? You could get in trouble for harboring me if Vance's men come looking." "Because it is the right thing to do," Zachary said simply. "And because I know what it is like to lose family. My parents and sister died in a winter storm 7 years ago. I was 19 years old and suddenly alone in the world. If someone had not helped me back then, I would not have survived. I figure I owe the universe a debt for that kindness." Something in Katherine's chest loosened at his words. She was not alone, not entirely. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Get some rest," Zachary said, returning to his whittling. "Things will look clearer in the morning." Katherine retreated to the spare room and crawled under the quilt on the narrow bed. She expected to lie awake, tormented by the images of the day, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally surrendering to the need for rest. She woke to pale morning light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then memory crashed back and she sat up, her heart racing. Thomas was dead. She was hiding on a stranger's homestead. Dangerous men might be looking for her. Katherine rose and smoothed down the oversized shirt she still wore, then ventured out into the main room. Zachary stood at the stove, tending to breakfast. He had shaved and changed into a clean shirt, and in the morning light, she could appreciate that he was quite handsome, in a rugged, weathered sort of way. "Morning," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected to, honestly." Katherine moved to the table and sat down. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Just sit. Breakfast is nearly ready." He brought over 2 plates loaded with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread toasted over the fire. "I have been thinking about your situation, and I think your best bet is to lay low here for a while. I need to ride into town today for supplies, and I can make some discreet inquiries about what people are saying, whether anyone is looking for you." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "But you need to stay out of sight. If Vance's men come around, you hide. There is a root cellar behind the house that they would not think to look in." Catherine wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for its heat. "You are putting yourself at risk for me." "I am a fair hand with a gun, if it comes to that," Zachary said calmly. "But I do not think it will. Vance does not know you came this direction, and even if he is looking, there are hundreds of homesteads scattered across this territory. The chances of him finding you here are pretty slim." She wanted to believe him, but fear had taken up permanent residence in her chest. "What if you are wrong? Then we deal with it when it happens." He met her eyes across the table. "One day at a time, Catherine. That is all any of us can do." The use of her name startled her. She realized she had not actually introduced herself. "I did not tell you my name." "You did, actually, last night when you were half asleep. You said your name was Katherine Calloway, and you asked me if I would write to your aunt in Philadelphia to tell her what happened to Thomas." Zachary took a sip of his coffee. "I told you I would. Do you remember that?" Catherine shook her head. She had no memory of the conversation, but she was grateful he had agreed. "My aunt is the only other family I have. She should know. I will write the letter today and post it when I go to town. It might take a few weeks to reach her, though." They ate breakfast together, and Catherine found herself studying Zachary when she thought he was not looking. There was something solid and reassuring about him, a quiet competence that made her feel safer than she had any right to feel given the circumstances. He was not overly talkative, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and measured. After breakfast, Zachary showed her around the homestead. He had 30 acres that he had claimed under the Homestead Act, and he had built everything with his own 2 hands over the past 7 years. The house, the barn, the fences, all of it was testament to his determination and skill. "It is not much," he admitted as they stood looking out over his land, "but it is mine. That means something." "It means everything," Catherine said softly. She understood the desire for something solid and real, something that could not be taken away. She had lost so much in recent years that the idea of having roots, of belonging somewhere, seemed almost impossibly precious. Zachary left for town mid-morning, taking the wagon and leaving strict instructions for Catherine to stay inside and out of sight. The hours stretched long in his absence, and Catherine found herself pacing the small house like a caged animal. She tried to occupy herself with cleaning, though the house was already quite tidy. She found herself drawn to the windows repeatedly, scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. By the time she heard the wagon returning in late afternoon, her nerves were stretched thin. She watched from behind the curtain as Zachary unhitched the horses and unloaded supplies, then finally came inside carrying a cloth sack. "Any trouble?" she asked immediately. "None." He set the sack on the table. "And I did not hear anyone talking about looking for a woman either. There was plenty of talk about the shooting, though. Seems Thomas caused quite a stir by calling out Vance." "What are people saying?" "Most folks think Vance is a cheat and a bully, but they are too scared of him to do anything about it. The official story is that Thomas drew first and Vance shot in self-defense." Zachary's expression was grim. The marshal ruled it justified and closed the case. Catherine felt sick. "So that is it? Thomas is dead and no one cares?" "I did not say that." Zachary pulled a folded newspaper from his pocket. There was an editorial in the Fargo paper written by the editor, a man named Edmund Burke. He questions the official account and suggests that perhaps the marshal should investigate more thoroughly. It is not much, but it shows that not everyone is willing to just accept Vance's version of events. She took the newspaper and read the editorial, her eyes filling with tears. Someone cared. Someone was willing to speak up, even if it was dangerous to do so. "This Edmund Burke, is he a good man?" "By all accounts, yes. He has written critical pieces about Vance before. So far, Vance has not done anything to shut him up, probably because it would look bad to go after the press too openly." Zachary paused. "I asked around about Marshal Whitaker, too. Word is he was through Fargo about 6 weeks ago, which means he is not due back for at least another month, maybe longer." A month. Catherine tried not to despair at the thought of hiding for that long, of living in limbo while she waited for justice that might never come. "I cannot ask you to let me stay here for that long." "You are not asking, I am offering." Zachary began unpacking the supplies he had brought. "Look, I will be honest with you. It gets lonely out here. The work is hard and the winters are harsh, and sometimes days go by without me seeing another soul. Having company, even under these circumstances, is not exactly a hardship for me. Katherine watched him put away flour and sugar and coffee, and she made a decision. Then let me help. I can cook and clean and help with the animals. I should earn my keep if I'm going to be here. Zachary looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you still need to stay out of sight when I have visitors. I do occasionally have neighbors stop by, and the fewer people who know you are here, the safer you will be. They fell into a routine over the following days. Katherine took over the cooking and cleaning, freeing up Zachary to focus on the harder physical labor of maintaining the homestead. She discovered that she actually enjoyed the work, the simple satisfaction of baking bread or hanging laundry or gathering eggs from the chicken coop. It was so different from her life in Philadelphia, where she had been groomed to be a proper lady, skilled in embroidery and piano, but utterly useless at practical tasks. Zachary was patient with her mistakes, showing her how to properly churn butter or mend a fence post without judgment. He answered her questions about homesteading and ranching, and she found herself genuinely interested in learning. There was something deeply appealing about this kind of life, hard as it was. It felt real in a way that her previous existence never had. In the evenings, they sat by the fireplace and talked. Zachary told her about his family, about growing up in Wyoming territory before his parents decided to try their luck in Dakota. He spoke of his younger sister Mary, who had been only 14 when she died, and Katherine heard the lingering grief in his voice even after all these years. In turn, Katherine told him about Philadelphia, about her parents and their comfortable middle-class life that had been upended by illness and debt. She told him about Thomas, about how he had always been restless and ambitious, how he had dreamed of making his fortune in the West. He was not a bad person, she said one night, staring into the flames. He just wanted more than what he had. I think he thought one big score would fix everything, would give us security. Instead, it got him killed. Wanting more is not wrong, Zachary said quietly, but there are smart ways to go about it and foolish ways. High-stakes gambling with men like Vance, that is about as foolish as it gets. Katherine knew he was right, but it still hurt to hear. I should have stopped him. I knew he was getting in over his head, but I did not say anything. It would not have mattered if you had. A man bent on a certain course will not be swayed by words, no matter who speaks them. Zachary set down his whittling and looked at her. You cannot blame yourself for your brother's choices, Katherine. That weight is not yours to carry. She wanted to believe him, but guilt was a persistent companion. I just keep thinking that if I had been more insistent, if I had found a way to make him listen, then he still would have done what he wanted, and you would be no better off than you are now, except you would also be eaten up with even more guilt. Zachary's voice was gentle but firm. I have been down that road. When my family died, I spent months torturing myself with all the things I could have or should have done differently. It nearly destroyed me. Finally, an old rancher I was working for sat me down and told me something I will never forget. He said the past is a place for learning, not for living. You can honor Thomas by living well, not by drowning in guilt. Katherine felt tears spill down her cheeks. How do I do that? How do I live well when he is gone? One day at a time, one choice at a time, you wake up in the morning and you do the next right thing, and then the thing after that. Eventually, the good days start to outnumber the bad ones. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, feeling young and lost. I do not know how to be this person. I do not know how to be alone in the world. You are not alone. The words were quiet, but absolutely certain. You are here, and I am here, and that is enough for now. Something in Katherine's chest cracked open at those words, at the simple kindness behind them. She realized that despite everything, despite the horror and loss and fear, she felt safer with Zachary Rourke than she had felt anywhere in a very long time. The days stretched into weeks, and September gave way to October. The prairie grasses turned golden and then brown, and the nights grew increasingly cold. Katherine continued to hide whenever Zachary had visitors, usually squirreling herself away in her room, or, on one memorable occasion, when a neighbor decided to drop by unexpectedly in the root cellar behind the house. But mostly, they were alone together, and Katherine found herself looking forward to their evenings by the fireplace with an intensity that sometimes surprised her. Zachary was an excellent storyteller when he chose to be, regaling her with tales of his adventures working cattle drives before he had claimed his homestead. She loved watching his face as he talked, the way his eyes lit up, when he recalled something particularly amusing. She was falling for him. The realization crept up on her gradually, but once she acknowledged it, it seemed obvious. She noticed everything about him now, the way he pushed his hair back from his forehead when he was concentrating, the quiet competence with which he approached every task, the gentleness in his hands when he tended to an injured horse or helped a chicken that had gotten tangled in the fence wire. Katherine told herself it was simply gratitude, that anyone would develop feelings for someone who had saved them and sheltered them. But she knew in her heart it was more than that. She genuinely liked Zachary Rourke. She liked his steadiness and his dry sense of humor, and the way he treated her as an equal, not as a delicate flower to be protected and coddled. She was terrified he did not feel the same way. Why would he? She was nothing but trouble and obligation, a burden he had taken on out of decency. She had no money, no prospects, nothing to offer him but her presence and her help around the homestead. And once Marshal Whitaker came through and she could safely testify against Vance, she would likely have to leave, to go somewhere far away where Vance's reach could not find her. The thought of leaving filled her with an ache she did not want to examine too closely. One afternoon in mid-October, Katherine was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard riders approaching. Fear shot through her, and she dropped the sheet she had been pinning up, ready to run for the root cellar. But then she heard Zachary's voice, calm and measured, greeting whoever had arrived. She crept around the side of the house and peered carefully around the corner. Two men sat astride horses in the yard, and Zachary stood facing them with his arms crossed. The men wore badges on their vests, and Katherine's heart sank. Lawmen. Had they come looking for her? Like I said, I have not seen any woman matching that description, Zachary was saying. I am out here alone most of the time. If a woman had come by, I would certainly remember it. We are just asking around, one of the men said. His voice was rough and unfriendly. Garrett Vance is concerned about the sister of that card cheat who got shot a few weeks back. Wants to make sure she is all right, you understand? Girl might be confused about what she saw. If I see her, I will be sure to let you know, Zachary replied, his tone perfectly neutral. The second man leaned forward in his saddle. You better. Vance does not like people who hide things from him. Would be a shame if something happened to this nice spread you have got here. Accidents happen, you know. Fires and such. Katherine saw Zachary's jaw tighten, but his voice remained calm. I appreciate the warning. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I have work to do. The men exchanged glances, then turned their horses and rode off. Zachary stood watching until they disappeared over the horizon before he finally relaxed his posture. Katherine stepped out from her hiding place, and he turned to look at her. They know someone is looking for me, she said, her voice shaking. That means Vance knows I'm alive. It means he suspects you are alive. He does not know where you are. Zachary walked over to her, his expression serious. But those men were not lawmen, despite the badges. They were Vance's hired thugs, which means he is taking this seriously enough to send men out searching. You should tell them I am here. Give me up. They threatened you, Zachary. They could burn your house down. I am not worth that risk. Let me worry about what is and is not worth the risk to me, Zachary said firmly. Those men are bullies and cowards. They like to make threats, but actually following through is another matter entirely. Half the territory would be burned to the ground if Vance acted on every threat his men made. But what if? No what ifs. We knew this might happen eventually. It does not change anything. He placed his hands on her shoulders, looking down at her intently. Katherine, listen to me. I am not going to let anyone hurt you. I gave you my word that you would be safe here, and I meant it. She looked up into his cedar eyes and saw absolute certainty there, along with something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Before she could stop herself, before she could think better of it, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. For a moment, Zachary went absolutely still, and Katherine's heart plummeted. She had made a terrible mistake. She started to pull back, to apologize, but then his arms came around her, and he was kissing her back, deep and slow and thorough. Katherine melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she returned the kiss with all the pent-up longing and fear and need that had been building inside her for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. I have been wanting to do that for days, he admitted roughly, but I did not want to take advantage of your situation. You are not taking advantage of anything, Katherine said breathlessly. I have been falling for you, Zachary. I tried not to. I told myself it was just gratitude or loneliness or fear. But it is not. I care about you. So much. I care about you too. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met, Katherine Calloway, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the tears she had shed over the past weeks. These were tears of hope, of joy, of something bright and precious taking root in her heart despite everything. They stood there holding each other in the October sunlight, and Katherine thought that maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of all this pain and loss. Maybe Thomas's death did not have to be the end of everything. Maybe it could be a beginning, too. That night, they sat together on the narrow bed in Katherine's room, and she told Zachary everything, all the fears she had been carrying, all the guilt and grief and anger. She told him about watching Thomas die, about the nightmares that still woke her some nights, about her terror that Vance would find her and kill her too. And Zachary listened to every word, his arm around her shoulders, occasionally pressing kisses to her hair. At some point, Katherine realized that her hair had become hopelessly tangled during her confession, snarled by her habit of running her fingers through it when she was anxious. Without a word, Zachary got up and retrieved a brush from the dresser. He settled behind her on the bed and began to gently work through the tangles, starting at the ends and working his way up. The simple intimacy of the gesture undid something in Katherine. She continued talking, the words pouring out of her, as Zachary patiently brushed her hair, his touch gentle and soothing. She told him things she had never told anyone, fears and hurts that went back years before Thomas's death. She told him about feeling lost and alone in the world, about wondering if she would ever find a place where she truly belonged. "You belong here," Zachary said quietly, still working the brush through her hair. "With me, if you want to, that is." Katherine twisted around to look at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that when this is all over, when Vance is dealt with and you are safe, I want you to stay. Not as a guest or someone I am helping, but as my wife, if you will have me." He set down the brush and took her hand. "I know this is fast, and the circumstances are not exactly conventional, but I know what I feel, Katherine. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you lying in that prairie grass, all fierce and terrified and refusing to give up." "I love you too," Katherine whispered. "God help me, I do. But Zachary, what if Vance—" "We will deal with Vance, together." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Marry me, Katherine. Say yes." She should say no. She should be practical and cautious, and remember that they barely knew each other really, that love was not enough to build a life on. But looking into Zachary's eyes, feeling the solid warmth of his presence beside her, Katherine found she did not care about practicality or caution. She had lost so much. She deserved to grab hold of this happiness with both hands and refuse to let go. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Zachary's answering smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, and Katherine gave herself over to it completely. They stayed like that for a long time, trading kisses and whispered promises, until finally they curled up together on the narrow bed and fell asleep in each other's arms. Over the next weeks, they made plans. They would wait for Marshal Whitaker to come through, and Katherine would give her testimony about what had happened. With any luck, the marshal would arrest Vance and Katherine would be free to live her life without fear. And then she and Zachary would get married, probably in a simple ceremony with whatever preacher happened to be passing through the territory. But life, Katherine was learning, rarely followed anyone's plans. It was early November when everything changed. Katherine was preparing dinner when she heard horses approaching at a gallop. Zachary was in the barn, and she ran to the window, her heart in her throat. 3 riders were coming fast, and she recognized one of them as the man who had threatened Zachary weeks earlier. She ran for the root cellar, but she was too slow. The door burst open just as she reached the back entrance, and rough hands grabbed her arms. She screamed, fighting against the grip, but the man was far stronger than she was. "Got her!" he yelled to his companions. "Told you she was here." Katherine heard Zachary shouting, heard the sound of a scuffle, and then a gunshot. Her blood turned to ice. "Zachary!" she screamed, struggling harder. "Your cowboy is fine," the man holding her said. "Just winged him to keep him down. Boss wants the girl alive, not her protector dead, at least not yet. They dragged Katherine outside, and she saw Zachary on the ground near the barn, blood streaming from his shoulder. He was trying to get up, his face contorted with pain and rage. "Let her go!" he roared. "This is between Vance and me. Leave her out of it." "Should have thought of that before you lied to us," one of the other men said. He kicked Zachary hard in the ribs, and Katherine cried out, "Stop! Please do not hurt him!" Tears streamed down her face as they hauled her toward their horses. "I will go with you. Just please do not hurt him any more." They threw her onto a horse, and one of the men climbed up behind her, his arm like an iron band around her waist. As they rode off, Katherine looked back and saw Zachary struggling to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw the promise there. He would come for her. He would not let this be the end. The ride to Fargo was a nightmare. Katherine's captor kept a bruising grip on her, and every time she tried to shift or ease the pressure, he would tighten his hold until she could barely breathe. By the time they arrived in town, she was shaking with fear and exhaustion. They took her to the saloon, the same one where Thomas had been killed. The sight of it made Katherine's stomach churn, but she forced herself to keep her chin up and her back straight. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Garrett Vance was waiting for her in his private office upstairs. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with cold gray eyes and an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rough frontier town. He studied Katherine for a long moment before dismissing his men with a wave of his hand. "Miss Calloway," he said once they were alone, "we finally meet properly. I must say you have caused me considerable inconvenience these past weeks." "Good," Katherine said with more bravery than she felt. "I hope I caused you sleepless nights too." Vance's expression did not change. "Your brother was a thief and a cheat. He accused me of the very crimes he himself was committing. When I called him on it, he drew his weapon. I had no choice but to defend myself." "That is a lie," Katherine said flatly. "I was there. I saw what happened. Thomas caught you cheating and you could not stand having your reputation damaged, so you shot him in cold blood. Your word against mine, Miss Calloway. And who do you think people will believe? A respected businessman or the desperate sister of a known card cheat?" Vance leaned back in his chair. "I am giving you a chance here. Keep your mouth shut about what you think you saw. Leave Fargo and never come back. And I will let you live. Continue to make trouble, and I will see to it that you suffer the same fate as your brother." Katherine's mind raced. If she agreed and left, she would be safe, but Vance would get away with murder. If she refused, she would likely end up dead. But either way, Zachary was in danger now. Vance knew he had been hiding her, knew that he had lied to protect her. "What about Zachary Rourke?" she asked. "The man who took me in. What happens to him?" "That depends on you. Cooperate and leave quietly, and I will consider the matter settled. Continue to be difficult, and I will make sure your cowboy loses everything he has worked for." Vance's smile did not reach his eyes. "It would be tragic if his homestead burned to the ground, if his livestock mysteriously died, if he found himself unable to get credit or supplies in town. A man can only take so much hardship before he breaks." Katherine felt trapped, caught between impossible choices. But then she thought of Zachary's words about doing the next right thing, about living well as a way of honoring those who had died. She thought about Thomas, who had died trying to expose a cheat. She could not let his death be meaningless. "No," she said firmly, "I will not keep quiet. I will not let you get away with what you did." Vance's expression hardened. "You are making a very foolish choice, Miss Calloway. Maybe, but it is my choice to make." The door burst open before Vance could respond, and Katherine's heart leaped as she saw Marshal Whitaker stride in, flanked by 2 deputies. The territorial marshal was a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Garrett Vance," Marshal Whitaker said formally, "you are under arrest for the murder of Thomas Calloway and the attempted murder of Zachary Rourke. You have the right to—" "This is absurd," Vance sputtered, his composure finally cracking. "On what evidence?" "On the testimony of 6 witnesses who have come forward in the past 2 days, all stating that they saw you shoot Thomas Calloway in cold blood. Additionally, I have sworn statements from 3 merchants in Fargo, detailing how you have threatened and extorted them. And just this afternoon, Mr. Edmund Burke of the Fargo newspaper provided me with documentation of your various illegal activities." Marshal Whitaker nodded to his deputies, who moved to restrain Vance. "You are finished here." Katherine felt dizzy with relief and disbelief. How did you know I was here?" "A severely injured but very determined cowboy rode into town about an hour ago and found me at the marshal's office. He told me what had happened and where to find you." Marshal Whitaker's stern expression softened slightly. "That young man loves you very much, Miss Calloway. He could barely stay on his horse from blood loss, but he refused to seek medical attention until he knew you would be safe." "Where is he?" Katherine asked urgently. "Is he all right?" "The doctor is tending to him now. The bullet went clean through, so he should make a full recovery." The marshal gestured toward the door. "Go on. I imagine he is worried sick about you." Katherine did not wait for him to say it twice. She ran from the saloon and down the street to the doctor's office, her heart pounding. She burst through the door to find Zachary sitting on an examination table, stripped to the waist, while the doctor wrapped his shoulder in clean white bandages. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert, and when he saw Katherine, relief flooded his features. "Katherine, thank God!" He tried to stand, but the doctor pushed him firmly back down. "Sit still, young man, or you will tear open what I just stitched up." The doctor glanced at Katherine. "You must be the young lady he has been fretting about. Well, he is going to be fine, though he needs rest and to avoid any strenuous activity for at least 2 weeks. Katherine moved to Zachary's side and took his good hand in both of hers. "You rode all the way to town with a bullet wound to save me." "Of course I did. You think I was going to just let Vance take you?" He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Katherine. I was not about to lose you. You could have died. So could you. At least this way. We both get to live." He managed a weak smile. "Besides, I had to make sure you did not change your mind about marrying me." Katherine laughed through her tears. "Not a chance. You are stuck with me now, Zachary Rourke." The doctor finished his work and left them alone. Katherine carefully wrapped her arms around Zachary, mindful of his injured shoulder, and held him close. They stayed like that for a long time, just breathing together, reassuring themselves that they were both safe and whole. Over the following days, the full story came out. Marshal Whitaker had been conducting his own investigation into Vance's activities for months, but he had lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest. Thomas's death had been the catalyst that finally brought witnesses forward. Combined with Katherine's testimony and the documentation Edmund Burke had provided, the case against Vance was overwhelming. Vance was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His assets were seized, and several of the businesses he had controlled were sold off to legitimate owners. The corrupt marshal who had been on Vance's payroll was removed from office and faced charges of his own. Fargo began the slow process of cleaning up its reputation and rebuilding trust in its institutions. Katherine and Zachary were married in late November, in a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who came through the territory. Edmund Burke attended, along with several of Zachary's neighbors who had become friends over the years. Katherine wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Zachary wore his best shirt and his only tie. When the preacher asked if they had rings, Zachary pulled out 2 simple gold bands that he had commissioned from the jeweler in Fargo. He slipped one onto Katherine's finger, and she did the same for him, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Zachary kissed her thoroughly enough to make several of their guests chuckle. They spent their wedding night in Zachary's house, which was now Katherine's house too. It felt strange and wonderful to think of it that way, to know that she finally had a home again, a place where she belonged. Zachary was gentle and patient with her, and Katherine gave herself to her husband with complete trust and love. The winter was harsh, but they weathered it together. Katherine learned how to make soap and candles, how to preserve food for the long cold months, how to keep the house warm and comfortable even when snow piled up past the windows. She discovered that she was good at these things, that she enjoyed the rhythm and purpose of homestead life. In the spring, Katherine planted a garden and helped Zachary with the planting of wheat and oats. She learned to ride a horse properly, and she and Zachary would sometimes ride out together across the prairie, watching the land come back to life after the winter's sleep. Katherine received a letter from her aunt in Philadelphia expressing shock and sorrow over Thomas's death, but also tentative happiness that Katherine had found love and stability in the Dakota Territory. She sent a small amount of money that Katherine and Zachary used to buy breeding stock for chickens and a milk cow. By summer, Katherine knew she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening, while they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. He was so happy he picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, then immediately set her down and apologized for being too rough. Their son was born in late February of 1878, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. They named him Thomas Zachary Rourke, honoring both Katherine's brother and the man who had saved them both. Little Thomas was a loud, active baby who kept them both busy and exhausted and absolutely delighted. Edmund Burke came out to the homestead that spring to meet the baby and to tell them that he had purchased the Fargo newspaper outright with money from investors who wanted to see an honest press in the territory. He asked Katherine to write about her experiences, and though she was hesitant at first, she eventually agreed. Her article about corruption in frontier towns and the importance of standing up for truth was reprinted in newspapers across the territory, and even back east. Katherine found that she enjoyed writing, and she began contributing regular columns to Edmund's paper about homestead life and the challenges facing frontier women. It brought in a little extra money and gave her a sense of purpose beyond the daily tasks of running the household. 2 years later, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Mary Rose, after Zachary's sister, and because roses were Katherine's favorite flower. Mary Rose was quieter than her brother, a thoughtful baby who studied the world with solemn eyes before breaking into smiles that lit up her whole face. The homestead prospered. Zachary expanded their land holdings and their herd, and they built a larger house with separate bedrooms for the children and a proper office where Katherine could write. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure, and that was more than Katherine had ever dared to hope for in those dark days after Thomas's death. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Zachary surprised Katherine with a trip back to Fargo. They left the children with a trusted neighbor and spent 2 nights at the newly renovated hotel, eating in the dining room and attending a theater performance that a traveling troupe had brought to town. It was a luxury they rarely indulged in, but Katherine treasured every moment of it, especially the time alone with her husband. On their last night in town, they walked through the streets hand in hand, and Katherine found herself standing outside the saloon where Thomas had died. It had been renamed and renovated, and there was no trace of the violence that had occurred there years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back east where things might have been easier?" Katherine looked up at her husband, at the man who had taken in a desperate stranger and given her not just shelter, but love, purpose, and a future. She thought about their children, about the home they had built together, about the life they were creating in this wild, beautiful territory. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "Everything I want is right here." They returned to the homestead and their children, and life continued in its pleasant rhythm. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved helping his father with the horses and listening to his mother's stories. Mary Rose was quieter, but just as sharp, with a gift for numbers that suggested she might be the one to manage the homestead's books when she was older. In 1882, when Thomas was 4 and Mary Rose was 2, Katherine gave birth to another son, whom they named William Edmund after Zachary's father, and the editor who had helped bring Garrett Vance to justice. William was a happy, easy baby who seemed content to watch his older siblings with amused tolerance. Katherine's articles for the newspaper had gained enough attention that a publisher back east contacted her about writing a book. She spent the better part of a year working on it, stealing hours late at night or early in the morning while the children slept. The book, titled Lessons from the Prairie, A Woman's Journey in Dakota Territory, was published in 1883 to positive reviews. It brought in enough money that Zachary was able to purchase additional land and hire help for the busiest seasons. But more than the money, Katherine treasured the letters she received from women across the country who had read her book and found inspiration in her story. She answered every letter personally, offering advice and encouragement to those who were struggling, sharing in the joys of those who were thriving. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas started school in Fargo, making the long ride each day with his father, before Zachary continued on to whatever errands or business needed attending. Mary Rose followed 2 years later, and William after that. The homestead was always full of life and noise and laughter, Everything Katherine had never known she wanted until she had it. She and Zachary grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and tension, but they had also learned how to talk to each other, how to listen, how to work through problems together rather than letting them fester. On quiet evenings, Katherine would sometimes think back to that day when she had been running across the prairie, terrified and alone, covered in her brother's blood. She would remember the moment Zachary had appeared on his paint horse, offering help to a stranger. It had been the luckiest day of her life, though she had not known it then. She thought about Thomas sometimes, wondering what he would think of the life she had built. Would he be proud? Would he approve of Zachary, of the children, of the choices Katherine had made? She liked to think he would be, that he would see how she had taken the second chance his sacrifice had given her, and made something good from it. In 1890, when Thomas was 12, Mary Rose was 10, and William was 8, Katherine gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Grace. The arrival of twins at her age, Katherine was 34 by then, was unexpected but joyfully received. The whole family doted on the babies, and even teenage Thomas, who was at the age where he pretended to be too mature for such things, could often be found making silly faces to get the twins to laugh. Zachary had turned 34 that same year, still strong and vital despite the hard life of a homesteader. He had streaks of silver in his dark hair now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the prairie sun, but Katherine thought he was more handsome than ever. Their homestead had become one of the most successful in the area, known for the quality of their livestock and crops. Other homesteaders would sometimes come to Zachary for advice, and he was always generous with his time and knowledge. Katherine hosted gatherings for the local women, sharing skills and stories and creating a sense of community in the isolated territory. Dakota Territory became the states of North Dakota and South Dakota in 1889, and the Rourke family celebrated the occasion with a large party at their homestead. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and there was dancing and music and more food than even their large gathering could consume. As Katherine watched her children playing with the other children, as she saw Zachary laughing with friends and neighbors, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had built. It had not been easy. There had been difficult years, seasons when the crops failed or the winter was too harsh, times when money was scarce and worry kept her up at night. But they had weathered every storm together, and they had emerged stronger for it. In 1895, young Thomas announced his intention to study law at a university back east. Katherine's heart ached at the thought of him leaving, but she was also fiercely proud of her eldest son, who had grown into a thoughtful, intelligent young man with a passion for justice that reminded her so much of his namesake uncle. Zachary arranged for Thomas to stay with Katherine's aunt, who was now quite elderly, but delighted at the prospect of having family nearby again. Mary Rose showed no interest in leaving the homestead. She was happiest when working with the animals or helping manage the business side of the operation. She had a head for numbers that far exceeded anyone else in the family, and by the time she was 15, she was essentially running the homestead's accounts. William was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book when he should have been doing chores. Katherine recognized something of herself in him, that desire for stories and words and ideas. She encouraged his reading and his writing, even as Zachary gently insisted he still had to pull his weight around the homestead. The twins, Samuel and Grace, were inseparable and brought endless energy and mischief to the household. They were 7 years old in 1897, still young enough to believe in magic and possibilities, and Katherine cherished their innocence even as she worked to guide them toward responsibility. In the spring of 1898, tragedy struck when Katherine's aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep. Thomas wrote with the news, and though Katherine grieved, she was grateful that her aunt had lived long enough to see her great-nephew and to know that Katherine was happy and thriving. The small inheritance her aunt left them was enough to make some long-needed improvements to the homestead and to set aside money for the younger children's education. That same year, Mary Rose met a young man named Jonathan Peters at a social in Fargo. He was the son of a local merchant, hard-working and respectful, and when he asked permission to court Mary Rose, both Katherine and Zachary gave their blessing. They married the following year in a beautiful ceremony at the homestead, and Jonathan joined the family operation, proving himself to be a valuable addition. Katherine was 43 when she became a grandmother for the first time in 1900. Mary Rose gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Catherine Ann, and holding her tiny granddaughter in her arms, Catherine felt the circle of life completing itself in the most beautiful way. Thomas came home from law school that summer, now a confident young man of 22 with his degree completed, and plans to set up practice in Fargo. He had offers from larger cities, but he wanted to come home, to use his education to help the people and place that had shaped him. Catherine could not have been more proud. William announced his intention to become a teacher, wanting to bring education to the rural areas where children often had limited access to schooling. He had always been the idealist, and Catherine supported his dreams even as she worried about the practical challenges he would face. The twins were growing like weeds, Samuel showing an interest in ranching and animal husbandry, while Grace seemed drawn to medicine, fascinated by healing and helping others. Catherine encouraged both of them, grateful that her children had opportunities she never could have imagined when she was their age. Through all the years and changes, one constant remained, her love for Zachary. If anything, it had grown deeper and richer with time, tempered by shared experiences and mutual respect. They still made time for each other, still sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about their days, still held hands when they walked across their land. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1897, Zachary gave Catherine a beautiful silver locket containing tiny photographs of all their children. Catherine gave him a new saddle she had been saving for, hand-tooled with intricate designs. But the real gift was the renewed vows they spoke to each other privately, promises to continue building their life together for as many years as they were given. In 1902, at the age of 46, Catherine published her second book, a collection of stories about frontier women she had met and interviewed over the years. It was well received, and the royalties provided additional security for their growing family. She had never imagined, running terrified across that prairie 25 years earlier, that she would someday be a published author, a grandmother, a respected member of her community. Thomas opened his law practice in Fargo and quickly built a reputation for honesty and competence. He took on cases others would not, helping those who could not afford to pay much, living up to the legacy of justice that his uncle had died for. Mary Rose and Jonathan expanded the homestead's operations, adding new ventures and opportunities. William began teaching at a rural school, traveling to remote homesteads and bringing education to children who otherwise would have had none. Samuel, now 12, was already showing the promise of becoming an excellent rancher, with an intuitive understanding of animals that impressed even his father. Grace, equally bright and determined, had begun accompanying the doctor in Fargo on his rounds, learning everything she could about medicine and healing. The homestead that Zachary had built alone now supported multiple generations. He and Catherine had built a true legacy, not just in land and livestock, but in their children and the values they had instilled in them. Hard work, honesty, compassion, justice. These were the gifts they had given their family. In the summer of 1905, the entire family gathered at the homestead for Catherine's 50th birthday. All 5 children were there. Along with Mary Rose's growing family, she had given Catherine 3 grandchildren by then. The house was full of laughter and love, and as Catherine looked around at the faces of those she loved most in the world, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after the party had wound down and the grandchildren had been put to bed, Catherine and Zachary sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the prairie. His arm was around her shoulders, and her head rested against his chest, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the evening. "Do you remember the day we met?" Catherine asked softly. "Every detail," Zachary replied. "You were lying in the grass with your hair all tangled and your eyes full of fear and defiance. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Catherine laughed. "I must have looked a mess. You looked like someone worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "And I was right. We have been very lucky," Catherine said. "Lucky, yes. But we also worked for this, Catherine. We chose each other every day. We chose to build something good out of pain and loss. That was not luck. That was us." She turned to look up at him. This man who had been her savior, her partner, her love for more than a quarter century. His hair was fully silver now, and there were deep lines in his face, but his cedar eyes were as warm and steady as they had been that first day. "I love you, Zachary Rourke, more than I have words to express. I love you too, Katherine Rourke. Always have, always will." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, marking the vast darkness of the prairie sky. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren slept, safe and loved. The land stretched out around them, fertile and productive, the result of decades of hard work and careful stewardship. Katherine thought about the girl she had been, running terrified across this same prairie, convinced her life was over. She thought about her brother Thomas, whose death had seemed like the end of everything, but had instead been the catalyst for a new beginning. She thought about all the choices she had made, all the challenges she had faced, all the joys and sorrows that had shaped her into who she was today. And she thought about the day Zachary had brushed the tangles from her hair while she told him everything that hurt, the day she had begun to heal, to hope, to believe in the possibility of happiness again. That single act of gentleness and care had been the foundation upon which they had built this entire life. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and new challenges. Thomas married a bright young woman named Sarah and gave Katherine more grandchildren. William married his teaching assistant, a kind woman named Elizabeth, who shared his passion for education. Samuel eventually took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, while Grace went east to study medicine formally, one of the few women in her class determined to bring modern medical care back to the frontier. Mary Rose and Jonathan's family continued to grow, filling the homestead with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. The operation expanded to include not just ranching and farming, but also a small general store that served the surrounding homesteads. The Rourke name became synonymous with integrity and quality throughout the region. Through it all, Katherine and Zachary remained at the center, the heart of the growing family. They had slowed down as the years passed, no longer able to work from dawn to dusk as they once had. But their wisdom and experience made them invaluable. Young people sought them out for advice, neighbors came to them to mediate disputes, and their children returned home regularly to share their lives and seek counsel. In 1912, Katherine was 57 and Zachary was 56 when they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. The entire family gathered again, now including 8 grandchildren, ranging in age from infant to 12 years old. They had a photograph taken. The whole family posed in front of the house, a testament to the legacy they had built. Looking at that photograph later, Katherine marveled at how far they had come. From 2 lonely people finding each other in desperate circumstances, to this, a sprawling family tree rooted in love and strengthened by shared values. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible. They grew old together gracefully, supporting each other through the aches and pains of aging, celebrating each new grandchild and great-grandchild as they arrived. Katherine continued to write, now mostly letters and journals, recording the family history for future generations. Zachary spent his days working alongside Samuel on the ranch, moving slower but still strong, still vital. On a crisp autumn evening in 1920, Katherine and Zachary sat on their porch, as they had done thousands of times before. She was 65 now, he 64, their hair white and their faces deeply lined, but their love as strong as ever. They held hands and watched the sunset, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of knowing each other completely. "It has been a good life," Zachary said softly. "The best life," Katherine agreed. "Better than I ever imagined it could be." "Any regrets?" Katherine thought about it, really considered the question. She thought about Thomas and the guilt she had carried for so long before finally learning to let it go. She thought about the hard years, the struggles and losses they had endured. She thought about the path not taken, the life back east she might have had if things had gone differently. "No," she said finally. "No regrets. Every choice, every challenge, every moment of pain and joy brought us here, brought us this." She gestured to the homestead, to the house where several generations now lived and thrived. "I would not change a single thing." Zachary squeezed her hand. "Neither would I." They sat together as the stars began to appear, marking another day in their long journey together. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, the sound of family and love and continuity. The prairie stretched out endlessly around them, wild and beautiful and home. Katherine thought back to that desperate girl running across this same landscape 47 years earlier, her hair tangled and her heart broken. She thought about the cowboy who had stopped to help, who had brushed the tangles from her hair and listened to everything that hurt. She thought about how that single moment of compassion, had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Sometimes the worst days lead to the best years. Sometimes the darkest moments are just before the dawn. Sometimes running away is actually running towards something better, even when you cannot see it yet. Katherine had learned all of these truths through living them, through choosing hope over despair, love over fear, again and again. The wind whispered across the prairie grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. Katherine rested her head on Zachary's shoulder and smiled, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. Their story, which had begun with violence and loss and fear, had become a testament to the power of love and kindness and second chances. From desperate beginnings, they had built something beautiful and lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the values they had instilled, the lessons they had taught through both words and actions. As the last light faded from the western sky and the stars blazed overhead in their ancient patterns, Katherine and Zachary sat together, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. They had weathered every storm, celebrated every triumph, and loved each other through it all with a devotion that only deepened with time. It was, Katherine reflected, more than enough. It was everything.